I'm Nick. I'm here today to tell you all about Stonehenge, the mysterious rock structure 80 miles southwest of London. To quote Jasmine in Aladdin, Stonehenge opened up a whole new world for me just about a year ago. I'm doing some reading and some research on it, and a common thing you'll hear people say about it is it's just a thing of rocks. It's nothing more, but I think it's way more profound than that, and I'm here to tell you why. Okay, the history of Stonehenge. Let's go through it. The first recorded mention of Stonehenge was in 1136 AD by this man named Geoffrey of Monmouth, a famous storyteller in England. And he had this book published, The Histories of the Kings of England, where he told this tale of Merlin and sorcery and Saxons warring a ravaged England in the time before the Renaissance. And people bought into it. People sort of took it as fact, even though it was clearly fiction. And that was actually the story on Stonehenge for about 500 years, moving into the Renaissance, when people started becoming concerned with science and how the world worked, in fact, not fiction. So documentary evidence is becoming a new thing. Historical evidence, empirical evidence, empirical records, record-taking history is becoming huge, sweeping all across Europe. And King James I gets into that. He visits Stonehenge, and he's just totally blown away because he's on a tour of England, and he is just so blown away. He actually has a very good friend of his back in London, Inigo Jones, who's the top architect in England, and they meet to talk about Stonehenge, and he actually tasks this man to go figure out what it was, what was the purpose of it. So Inigo Jones and his son-in-law John Webb go out there, and they do some research, and they look back to Roman times. They go through the history of England, and the Romans were actually in Britain for about 400 years. And so they research these old Roman books on architecture, and they find this one De Architectura, which is, I think, from about 40 BC. And there's two structures in it. There's an octanos and a meniktenos. And they're essentially like open temples. And they thought because Stonehenge was open towards the sky, that maybe it was one of these structures to worship the sky god Kailas. They published their findings. This is like the 1600s. People were even skeptical at the time. The next man who researched Stonehenge still has weight today. His name was John Aubrey. So he actually grew up in a town nearby Stonehenge. And when he saw those findings, he actually thought that Inigo Jones brought an architect's bias. And Aubrey was actually the top surveyor in England. So he wanted to go do a proper survey job. He did 25 years of research at Stonehenge. And actually, one famous thing he's known for, here, let me get a notebook so I can draw it, is the Aubrey holes. So Stonehenge is a circle, right, with a bunch of stones, some of which I'll talk about in a minute. There's stones on the inside. And Aubrey found pits that are in the exact circumference of where stones are laid, with dead bodies and other findings, animal bones, deer antlers. And so those are called the Aubrey holes. And so they didn't have enough science back then to research them, like all the intricacies of the objects. But some of the objects are still being looked at today, and have come to help scientists discover what Stonehenge might have been. More importantly, after Aubrey's research, he concludes that Stonehenge was a Druid temple. The Druids were in Rome for almost 400 years before the Romans. They had a short little reign, and there's no written records of them, but they were thought to have had animal sacrifices and, kind of goofy stuff like that. And there's still Druids today that go to Stonehenge on the solstice, and they feel a spiritual connection to it. But so Aubrey's the guy who gave Stonehenge the Druid theory, which stuck for several hundred years. And after Aubrey, there was actually a man, William Stukeley, who was a Druid himself in the early 1700s. He went out there, and he might have had a confirmation bias, but he did some more surveying and more research, and he concluded that it was a Druid temple as well. Where the lid comes off Stonehenge is around the time of the American Civil War. A British scientist, John Lubbock, in 1862, determines that Stonehenge was made by prehistoric man, with all the findings over the years and the world getting more condensed with technology and travel at this time, they have a better idea of the eras before the medieval times. So they know that they have the Bronze Age, they date to about 2700 BC. So they just know from what fragmentary evidence there is that tools started around that time, but that man and the human race essentially did not have tools before that time. So because some of the stuff in the Aubrey holes and other people dug up was cremated remains, they just know from other sites that didn't happen in Britain in the Bronze Age. So he dated it to about 3000 BC, and that blew the lid off Stonehenge. A little bit about the rocks at Stonehenge. Okay. A little bit about the stones at Stonehenge. So the Saracens weigh about as much as a humpback whale on average, 25 tons. The largest one, I believe, is 45 tons. There's less than 100 stones left at Stonehenge today, a lot of which we don't know what happened to them. They were ruined, maybe when the Romans came in. There was even a town, Amesbury, nearby where you could rent a hammer and chip off a piece of the stone. So a lot of that stuff has been lost to history. But anyway, the Saracens generally are about 13 feet high and on average 25 tons. And they're more of a sandstone, so you can take a hammer and chip away at it. The smaller stones within the inner circle are the blue stones. They're about 1 to 3 tons, which is about the same as a modern car. And they're about 3 to 6 feet high in height. And they're called blue stones because it rains a lot in England and they have like a bluish hue a lot of times, or maybe they used to when they're in previous days after it rains. So they kind of look blue on the horizon. The Saracens used to be whiter actually, but as time has eroded their minerals, they're a little bit darker. So the stones, the fact that they were, again, the people who built it did not have tools. How did this get built? Where did the stones come from is the second important question. So the Saracens came from 20 miles north. They figured this out a couple hundred years ago. There's a quarry, Marlborough Downs, where the Saracens, scientists have proved it. Theories back then were correct. The Saracens came from there. So the only way they came from there was they were dragged. Ropes back then were made with animal hairs. And they've actually done experimental archaeology where they probably didn't have wheels back then, but they most likely had like a sled-like mechanism that they could put the stone on and then they could drag it, or they literally just dragged it on the ground. And they've done experiments to do this. The blue stones weren't discovered. People always had questions about those until 100 years ago because there's nothing like them near Stonehenge. Around World War I, like 1919, they finally discovered that they were from the Preseli Mountains in Wales, which is about 140 to 50 miles, depending on which site you're looking at, from Stonehenge. And it's around up north and to the west of where Stonehenge is. Stonehenge is in the southwest of England. So how did they get there? So there's two theories. One, the original theory, is that they came by boat. So that they were at a quarry, most likely closer to the ocean, obviously in Wales. And so they were put on boats, they came down the ocean, they got the River Avon, and boom, they got right up to Stonehenge, and then were moved. But the Millennium Project in 1996, and even in 2000, they did an experiment with what would be similar boats at the time, tried to put them in there, and they only went a few miles before sinking. A lot of experts, especially Michael Parker Pearson, think that the boats just weren't that good at the time. So they conceivably had a land route, which is the modern A40, up to at least the border with England, I believe, and then the peaks and valleys are sort of intuitive enough that you could follow it down to Stonehenge. So they probably had a land route where they had ropes with animal hairs. They had some mechanism to drag them, and they literally dragged them all the way down. Now here's the question. Why would they do it? Okay. I think the best theory is that they represented dead ancestors. There's a few, if you really think about basic ideas, I mean, again, strip your mind of all technology, laptops, books, things you were raised on, religion, just everything. If you were just had no context, and you were in an early civilization like that, you'd probably associate stone with strength and possibly eternity, and wood with life, because it's not permanent and it can be fractured and bent and it can die. So there's probably contrast there. So stone probably rendered a deeper contrast within individuals and communities. So perhaps these stones represented the dead. There was some connection there, and there was some issue that made them drag them down to Wales. Okay, on to this millennium. The last 20 years of research at Stonehenge has been fascinating. So we're in this era, we're coming into this era now where we know that Stonehenge wasn't Roman temple, wasn't a Druid temple, was built by cavemen per se, Neolithic is the proper term, pre-Bronze Age people. And there's something going on with the stars. So Stonehenge is this two-pronged idea. Is it a thing for people, or is it a thing for the stars and astrology? Is it more of like a clock, or is it more something cerebral? Here's, I think, the best theory. So this professor, Michael Parker Pearson, from England, started doing research in 2004 at Stonehenge. They were actually able to purchase some acres at this farm nearby because Parker Pearson wanted to survey the whole land and just to get as many clues as possible, which could give you an idea of the essence of Stonehenge, if you really think about it. I mean, think about it. If you're looking back at something in your life and like you want to get all the clues together, right? And that's going to give you like a big answer as to why. Like, why did I act that way? Well, XYZ happened when I was a kid, and like there was this incident when I was in high school. It's all connected. So he's going around the site. There's the largest Neolithic site in Britain is Durrington Walls. That's 2 miles from Stonehenge. So they're actually able, with technology, if they go to, here, let's map it out on this paper. Here's Stonehenge. I'm not going to draw like a million little circles, whatever. Here's the avenue up to Durrington Walls, which they've discovered in the last 100 years, which is shell remnants and stuff. And here are these little houses. So with carbon dating, they're actually able to go into a house and determine from the mineral composites on the ground that like the kitchen was here, perhaps the family gathered here around a fire. A lot of times you'll have leftover food, hazelnuts, whatever. And maybe the door was here. Okay, so if other houses have the door here, is there places they meet here, etc.? Everything's connected. And so what's really important about Durrington Walls is there's a clone of Stonehenge nearby in wood called Woodhenge, literally. And so the technology and the excavation techniques are so good that even if there's nothing in the hole, as long as they find the hole, they can determine what was there in its place, which is really fascinating if you think about it. And they can do, mineral analysis and all this interesting science on it, carbon dating especially, determine how old it is. So Parker Pearson comes up with this theory is basically going back to this essence that maybe wood was associated with living and life and stone was associated with death and eternity. That maybe people came to worship at Woodhenge and then they would go down the avenue or the River Avon, which I believe is right adjacent to it, and they would go die at Stonehenge. So that Stonehenge essentially was a temple to worship the dead. I think that's honestly probably the best theory. There's other theories from the bones they found that maybe it was a place of healing. There's evidence of early surgery, primitive surgery. There's different DNA analysis is done that have seen bones from Italy, what was Italy back then, what was France, far away in Europe. The Ice Age it lasted until about 10,000 BC, and there was a land bridge from France to England. So there probably was a lot of, who knows? I mean, I'm not quoting this as a fact, I'm speculating, but maybe there was a lot of connectivity, and Stonehenge was this place where you could go worship and maybe heal if you had some injury. I'm sure back in those days there were lots of injuries. Life was brutal. So, I mean, who knows? I don't think we'll ever know what Stonehenge is. But the fact that we can get that close really interests me. And it really interests me to do a deeper dive on things because a lot of times in life, I'm definitely guilty of this. We look at things on the surface and we tend to be superficial. But really, if you really get into the nuts and bolts and details and think about what people were thinking and doing and et cetera, it can really enhance your perspective on something. And I think Stonehenge has done that for me the last year or so. So anyway, thanks for listening. Bye.